To our panel on the relevance of Vajrayana Buddhism to community. It's one I'm quite excited about. And I have here once again Kathryn Devaney of the Berkeley Alembic, and Charlie Awbery, who will be interviewing, who's the head of Evolving Ground, co-head of Evolving Ground. So for starters, why don't you kick us off and just tell us a little bit about what Evolving Ground is and its particular spin on Vajrayana.
I would like to check in with everyone who's here and just hear who is familiar with the term Vajrayana. Raise your hand if you've heard the term Vajrayana. Anybody who has not heard Vajrayana mentioned or...
I've heard it.
Yeah. So when I use the term Vajrayana, Vajrayana is just huge. It contains multitudes. It contains contradictions. There are many different paths. So when I use the word Vajrayana, what I'm really referring to is the kind of Vajrayana that I like and that I have practiced for many years. And that comes from the yogic lineages. It comes from the village tradition in Tibet, the non-monastic, non-institutionalized groups, gatherings, gars. There's this Tibetan term gar, which is like an encampment. And so the yogis would gather, they'd have an event, they'd get together, they'd be in a community together, and then they would go off and disperse and then come together for different events or different occasions. So I feel this strong connection to a village Vajrayana, and in creating Evolving Ground, it emerged from relationship, it emerged organically, and in bringing Evolving Ground into being, a lot of those influences, I think, inflect what Evolving Ground is. So it is a community. It's a community for contemporary Vajrayana exploration and practice together. And we're bringing into being different practices, new forms of ancient practices, in order to experience better relationship, basically. So one of the ways that I think about Vajrayana is it is relationship. The method is relationship, and the result is relationship. So talking about community, there's this there's an interesting meta thing that happens, that we have a community, and then the community is in order to practice community, in order to understand what it means to be in community and to have better norms, better ways of communicating, better community, beautiful community, enjoyable community. And so the practice of Vajrayana is relationship. Across the board, that's a big generalization, but it's about relationship. Everything in Vajrayana is about relationship. We bring that practice and create beautiful community. And it's like a kind of sandbox for relationship in all forms of life. So we think of the gatherings that we have as being sandbox community. We have different methods for relating. Like one gathering will have a very different method, very different texture, like a different atmosphere, a different feel to another one. We're experimenting with that a lot. So, yeah. I feel like I could just kind of ramble on now for like the rest of the session. So I don't know whether there's anything in that you want to pick up on, or that we could thread that we could continue.
I'm curious to hear how a Vajrayana-based community might come together in a different way than, for example, like a bowling league. Like that's also about community, but they're maybe not spotlighting it in the same way. And there's a Sangha component. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the differences between just a general community coalescing and a Vajrayana-based one.
That's a very interesting question, because so there's Sangha, and Sangha in a traditional sense, a Sangha is there's a practice, in Vajrayana called pure view, pure vision. And that practice is to regard everybody that you're with, everybody that you're in contact with, in a space together, as already perfect, already enlightened, already awake, as doing their utmost best in the circumstances. And that is just a base assumption in a Sangha setting. So what do you do with that? I mean, you can immediately, you can see what a lot of problems that could give rise to. Like if somebody's behaving like a fuckwit and, you know, everything's kind of going pear-shaped and you're sticking with a fixed view of, oh, well, they're a perfect being, you know. Well, you know, there's a mess. There's a mess. So how do you bring practices like that so that they can actually change, seriously change, the way that we relate, and at the same time not have those pitfalls that are so likely to occur if you just get on a track and you're only going kind of blindfold down that track and not using your common sense, bringing your common sense. So one of the things that we're doing is, what is it like to have that experience for a short period of time? We'll have maybe a project or a working group or a way of being together where, okay, we're actually experimenting with this experience and regarding everybody in this way, within a particular light, like almost like unconditional positive regard, with kindness and with awareness, and we are looking out for each other at the same time. We have an end stop to the time that we are experimenting with that view, and we have a time for processing and saying, well, actually that didn't work for me at a certain point, or, you know, so we have a holding environment for the container of that view so that we can mitigate for things becoming more cult-like, for example. So we have one group we meet every month that is called Vajra Community, and it started off as cult avoidance group, but now you know, it's Vajra Community. Anyone in the community can come to that group. We discuss how do we have good norms, how do we maintain really good norms, what are good norms for interrelational practice, how do we do that? So we had, out of that meeting, some of our explicit norms were born, and you can see these on the websites. We have one that is skillful disagreement, so bringing awareness to being able to disagree, and to disagree kindly, and to disagree firmly. You know, how do you disagree well? Another one is curious skepticism. Try to remember what they all are now. So skillful disagreement, expressing doubt, and curious skepticism. These are absolutely fundamental for the foundation of the community. Now, if you think of a traditional Vajrayana community, that would, I mean, expressing doubt is a bit of a no-no in a traditional sense. So these are some of the ways that we are understanding what has gone wrong, what has led to really not great experience in traditional communities, and we're looking at, well, what is it to express doubt in relation to the principles of Vajrayana? Well, that is connected to being confident with form. Actually, it's being confident with your own form as different and separate from other. So being able to train boundaries, train autonomy as a foundational requisite, if you like, before entering the path of Vajrayana is actually extremely important. There's a lot of emphasis on emptiness as the base, spaciousness of self as the base for Vajrayana in the tradition. Well, what about form? You know, form is compassion. form is compassion for direction, compassion for personal autonomy. And so we have a lot of training as our foundation. We have ethical maturity, personal autonomy, receptive presence, spaciousness, and those are the foundations for heading into the path of tantric practice and Vajrayana.
I was really curious about this practice of you mentioned before, and it might sound impossible to implement. Like, let's say we're in a situation where I'm your roommate, I'm leaving dirty socks in the living room, I'm late on rent, and then you confront me and I say, like, you're so high maintenance. Like, I'll get to the rent eventually, I'll clean the socks, I don't know. Or maybe I won't. Like, let's say you're holding this view that I'm an enlightened being and I'm trying my best. How tangibly might you perceive me in this moment, and how would that scene look different to you than someone not practicing?
So I have a problem with this word enlightened being.
Sure.
So I would not use that phrase. I would put it more as a practice of view from myself than projecting onto the other person, like, oh, they are a thing, a fixed thing. So, I would not have a problem with saying, look, dickhead, what's going on here? You're laying your socks all over the space. What is this? What's the sock thing? There's no sense that you have to adopt some kind of artificial Buddhist personality or step into a particular fixed kind of role or it's much more like bringing an attitude of understanding to context. Context is everything. Context is so important. So you have a situation, something arises, something is causing a problem for other people, then yeah, of course you address that. You might talk about that in some way. You would use your common sense. But I think you can't prescribe exactly how somebody should be in a particular circumstance. There is no prescriptive behavior possible, and that can be pretty scary, right? That can be like, well, actually I need a set of rules. Well, how do you respond when the rules is kindness or the rule is awareness, and that there's very little to grasp onto in that situation? We're mostly an online community, and that has in some ways that makes things a lot easier because you can set those kind of rules and norms or guidelines of ways of being before living together in a community. So it's very different when people come together and they're living together.
I'm curious about sorry, go ahead. No. Okay, I'm curious about the pros and cons of that, of being an online community, because in some ways people are a little bit braver and more willing to sort of troll online. There's less consequences because you don't have to be in the same space as the other person. Of course, you don't have to deal with the dishes in the sink problem either. And I think there's a lot of other probably pros and cons that I'm not aware of building a community online versus in person. And I'm curious what you've been seeing as, I don't know, also your background with Arrow, like was that mostly in person or was that online too? And how do you see the differences between being online and in person?
Very different. So yeah, my experience with the Arrow was entirely in person. I moved to Finland for several months every year in order to be with the Sangha there and to...
This is a Vajrayana group.
Yeah, this is a Vajrayana, fairly traditional Vajrayana group, yeah. And that Sangha is mostly in person. Evolving Ground, we started mid-COVID in July 2020, and so my co-founder Jared and I, we didn't meet each other in person for 2 years. It was a couple of years after we'd been talking together and getting to know each other and starting Evolving Ground. It was only then that we met in person. I've now moved to Colorado to be closer. And so we have in-person gatherings starting. We have New York regular, New York, Brooklyn gathering that Andrew runs here every week, and we have European group working with emotional practice, working with the emotions. We have Colorado gatherings, Boulder gatherings happening. What was I speaking about?
So what do you see as some advantages of having an online-only community compared to
right.
an in-person? Yeah.
We did quite a lot of experiment with Zoom space. So, for example, some people will very naturally be quiet in a Zoom room and not be bringing, not be wanting to talk or be a little shy, and others will very easily talk a lot or hold the space and bring their stuff. So we have one practice which is, if you are used to being silent in a Zoom setting, see what it is like to do something different. Bring your voice, bring your experience. And if you are somebody who very easily, very comfortably can talk for a long time, can bring your experience, see what it is like to not do that, actually to stay in the Zoom room, to stay in the group, and not say something for the whole duration, and play with whatever your personal norm is. That has been so interesting as a practice. It's just been so great to have people holding the space for other people when they are the ones who are used to doing a lot of talking, or it's just beautiful. It's been really nice it's been a lovely way to have everybody feel that they're involved as well, and to challenge themselves without, in a very supportive space.
So I had this question that I was dying to ask you, which was, I know in Vajrayana, there's, at later stages of practice, often people doing deity yoga, which maybe you could describe, but from what I understand, it's, you visualize very viscerally becoming an enlightened deity often from this pantheon, existing pantheon. I'm curious, how does this play into community at all? Like, do people start interacting at a dinner party as if they're, Vajrakilaya or some other deity, or does it stay confined in solo practice?
Have you heard of deity yoga, yidam practice? Has anyone practiced yidam? A little bit. Who has this sense of like, ew, no, not for me? Anyone? Sometimes, yeah. What is it about that?
I don't want to go insane. I don't want to start
no.
believing that I'm like a god.
A god.
It's a manic
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
The way that I am conceiving yidam practice is as self-possibility. So we have EG Fundamentals path, so it's a journey that people can take. There are nodes, maybe it's like a network, there are nodes or modules within that journey. So I spoke a little bit earlier about personal autonomy. You could see that as being the absolute foundation, the base, personal autonomy. From that, what do you do with that? Where do you take that? So the way that I am conceiving yidam practice is that it is self-possibility. There are many, many hundreds of yidams. If you've practiced yidam, it involves a lot of ritual, a lot of, like you said, Tyler, bringing form. You're putting yourself into the form of the yidam. You're becoming a being. This is a particular form of yidam practice, so it isn't all like that. There are many different forms, but there is one that is self-arising yidam. You become the form of yidam. Now, yidam is a quality. It's a quality of being, a characteristic. Tara, compassion. Green Tara, red Tara, Vajrakilaya, power. How do you step into these possibilities? So if you deformalize yidam practice, if you relate to it in principle, like it is a practice that is offering so many different ways of being, qualities of being. You could take a quality of being and you can have that as a possibility for yourself. And so there are a number of ways that we practice that more formally in terms of a symbol, finding a symbol, and then stepping into that way of being for yourself. Finding that way of being. What is it like to find compassion in context? Actually have that way of being readily available. To know that, to seriously know that, to know what that is in your way of being, to be able to step into that in different contextual circumstances. What is it like to find your powerfulness, or your integrity in different contexts? To just know, to know who you are in integrity or in power. So there are a number of different ways that we can practice that we can relate that and bring that to the practice of community, of being in community with each other. So that's the self possibility. Yiran has been turned into a more like off the cushion and informal practice of self possibility. So we'll have like ways of relating to self-possibility, have different group practices or discussion groups or life circumstances that people can bring and discuss, like, well, how would I bring my practice to this circumstance?
So now we have time for one short question. We're technically a little bit over.
It's not a short question.
Question.
You know, given the scope of experience you've had across different contexts, right, like online communities to more traditional in-person communities, like, there's a wealth of rites and rituals in Vajrayana Buddhism that, you know, aside from being discussion points of spiritual self-cultivation, are like quite concrete activities for kind of energetic synchronization between people or the facilitation of, you know, collective experiences. Do you see potential for leveraging those activities, those rites and rituals, as a tool for social cohesion in a non-monastic, non-institutionalized setting for community's sake, or do you think it's very difficult to procure the same effect outside of a monastic or more institutionalized context?
So you mean like group ritual practices like Wang, like Sok?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's entirely possible. I think it's totally possible. Yeah.
Who leads them in that context? Like, who orchestrates and manages the activity?
I do, in some instances. And some situations will have more of like a group process bringing the experience into being. So, and then we'll have a script, and we'll go through the not a script exactly, but we'll know what we're going to do at different times. So we'll have maybe a starting practice, and then a group coming together in like a music practice, and then so we'll create the ritual and then participate in that ritual. But yeah, I think there's a lot of possibility there. And what's interesting to you about who leads that? Like, where's that question coming from? What's in that?
Just because, like, from what I've seen, there seems to be an inverse proportion between how potent those rituals can be in terms of making people feel something that fundamentally shifts their worldview or how they relate to the people around them. Between the potency, but potency like managed by, you know, a figure everyone orients to as a guru figure or someone who's empowered.
Right. I think I understand what's there in that question. So traditionally, there is a strong orientation towards a lama. And because the lama is viewed in a particular way, there is a kind of atmosphere can come about, like an atmosphere in connection to the mandala of the lama. And that can be extremely strong. It can be potent. There can be a kind of energetic potency that makes transformation possible. So the question is, how do you do that? How do you have that kind of an atmosphere created without the power relationship that makes it only possible in relation to the Lama? So I'm very interested in that. You know, what I want to make possible is the experience of a different mindset, a different way of being that is not reliant on that relationship and in that context only. So like creating the situation that you have to then go back to that context in order to have that same experience, in order to experience the world in a different way, or experience a different way of being. So what is it that makes that possible and makes it possible for any individual or any group of people to find that in different contexts? I think that is entirely possible. I think it's to do with the nature of insight, the nature of revelation as it occurs, like spontaneous insight. It's possible to facilitate somebody's autonomy to find that and to have that way of being in different circumstances. It's very difficult to put into words. It's extremely difficult to say, oh, and we do this and then that happens, because it relies on the aliveness, the connection, the spontaneity of the circumstances. So like, for example, we could say we were on retreat in January and something happened and that was extraordinary. There was an extraordinary experience. Like, people went from that retreat changed. Now, does that change how they are in their lives, in their relationships? Well, if it doesn't, then it's not working. If it doesn't, then there's no point. Yeah, it's fantastic to have a highly energized, awesome, transformative, amazing experience, but if you go away from that and it's not available, and that difference in experience is not can't be tapped into again, then something has failed there. Something is not working. So yeah, I think about that a lot. About how is it possible to create practice that people can engage with off retreat as well, or in different circumstances. Like practice with the emotions, practice with interrelational norms, different ways of being with each other. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Thank you.